Have you ever looked into the eyes of a creature and seen a reflection of your own loneliness staring back? Before we begin, if stories like this touch your heart, please like the video, subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It means a lot to us. The late October rain wasn't falling, it was weeping. A cold, persistent drizzle that blurred the lines between the gray Pennsylvania sky and the muddy fields below. It was the kind of rain that seeped into your bones, whispering of forgotten summers and the long, hollow ache of winter coming. Late October 2023. The air smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and the distant, wood smoke tang of a neighbor's struggling chimney. Sarah stood at the warped wooden frame of the barn door, her breath fogging the chill air. Her hands, chapped and red from the cold and the relentless work, gripped the rough timber. She wasn't from here, this sprawling, slightly ramshackle farmhouse tucked away in the Allegheny foothills. She was escaping here. 6 months ago, the carefully constructed life she'd known in Philadelphia, the high-pressure marketing job, the apartment with the city view, the engagement ring that felt increasingly like a shackle, had simply imploded. The ring was returned. The apartment keys handed over. The job resignation email sent with a trembling hand she could barely still. All that remained was the echoing silence of loss and the crushing weight of not knowing who she was without the things that had defined her. Her great-aunt Martha's old farm, left vacant for years, became her improbable refuge. It wasn't healing, exactly. More like hiding. The sheer, exhausting physicality of clearing decades of accumulated junk, patching leaky roofs, and wrestling with a temperamental old furnace left little room for the gnawing thoughts. But the quiet, the vast, empty quiet of the place when the work stopped, that was the hardest part. It amplified the hollowness inside her. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life. And then there was her. The locals called her Shadow. Or sometimes, less kindly, that scrappy bitch. She wasn't Sarah's cat. She wasn't anyone's cat. She was a fixture of the barn, a fierce, semi-feral tortoiseshell phantom who regarded humans with a cold, unwavering suspicion that bordered on contempt. Sarah had first glimpsed her weeks ago, a flash of mottled brown, black, and amber fur vanishing into the dark recesses of the hayloft, like smoke dissolving. Since then, their interactions had been fleeting, tense standoffs. Sarah saw her now, a low silhouette perched atop a stack of weathered feed sacks near the back wall. The barn air was thick with the scent of old hay, dust motes dancing in the weak shafts of gray light filtering through high, cobwebby windows, and the sharp, feral odor of the cat herself. Shadow didn't flee immediately. That was new. She just what? Her eyes, they were the most startling thing. Not the usual cat green or gold, but a pale, almost luminous chartreuse, like lichen on wet stone. They held no warmth, only a bottomless, ancient wariness. They tracked Sarah's every move, unblinking, assessing the threat level. Sarah moved slowly, deliberately, towards the rusty old sink she'd managed to coax into dripping cold water. She needed to refill the buckets for the evening. Her boots crunched on the gritty concrete floor. Shadow tensed. A low, guttural sound, not quite a growl, not quite a hiss, vibrated in the cat's chest. It was a sound of pure, distilled warning. Stop. Go no further. Sarah froze. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. More respectful. Intimidated by the sheer, untamed force of will radiating from that small, ragged body. She could see the signs of Shadow's life etched into her. A nick missing from the tip of one ear, a legacy of some long-ago battle. patches where her thick fur was thin or slightly scarred beneath. Her frame, though lean, hinted at wiry strength. Her tail, thick and banded with dark stripes, twitched just once, a whip-crack of impatience. "Just getting water," Sarah murmured, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the barn's damp silence. "Not bothering you." The cat didn't blink. Those pale, unsettling eyes remained locked onto Sarah's face. There was intelligence there, sharp and calculating, and an ocean of mistrust. Sarah had tried, tentatively over the weeks. A bowl of kibble left near the barn door, always licked clean by morning, but never touched while Sarah was watching. A discarded cardboard box placed invitingly in a sheltered corner, ignored. Shadow existed on her own terms, a solitary monarch ruling her decaying kingdom of wood and shadows. Sarah turned the stiff faucet handle. The water gurgled, then spat, then began a reluctant trickle into the bucket. The sound seemed to break the spell. Shadow rose smoothly, silently. She didn't run. She flowed, melting backwards off the sacks and vanishing into the deeper gloom behind a stack of moldering hay bales. Gone. Like she'd never been there. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The hollow feeling inside her seemed to swell, filling the space left by the cat's departure. The loneliness wasn't just hers, she felt it emanating from Shadow too. A different kind, feral and self-reliant, but loneliness all the same. A solitary creature guarding her solitude with tooth and claw. Sarah finished filling the buckets, the plink-plink of water droplets hitting the surface the only sound. She looked towards the shadows where Shadow had disappeared. Nothing. Just the dusty gloom. She hefted the heavy buckets, the cold metal biting into her palms, and turned towards the barn door leading back to the equally cold, empty house. Outside, the weeping rain continued. The fields were a blur of brown and gray. Winter was coming, a season of stillness, of hibernation. Sarah paused on the threshold, the damp wind pulling at her hair. She felt utterly adrift, a stranger in a strange, quiet land. The thought of months spent mostly alone, with only the echo of her own doubts and the fleeting, hostile presence of a barn cat, felt suddenly overwhelming, crushing. But as she stepped out into the rain, a strange thought flickered, fragile and unexpected. We're both hiding here, both alone. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was just recognition. A quiet, startling shift in the landscape of her own isolation. Something had begun, not with a purr, but with a watchful, pale-eyed stare in the gloom of a rainy barn. The faintest tremor in the vast, cold silence. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It became the soundtrack to Sarah's solitude, a constant, drumming murmur against the farmhouse roof, a hiss through the skeletal branches of the oak tree outside her kitchen window. It trapped her indoors, amplifying the silence within the old walls. The echo of her own footsteps, the creak of ancient floorboards, the relentless tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hallway, it all pressed in heavy and suffocating. She busied herself with indoor tasks, sanding down a windowsill thick with decades of paint, sorting through boxes of Aunt Martha's faded linens smelling faintly of lavender and cedar, anything to keep the gnawing thoughts about her abandoned life at bay. But the quiet always won. Her thoughts inevitably drifted to the barn. To her. Shut up. Those pale, watchful eyes in the gloom. That low, vibrating warning in her chest. The sheer, untamed aloneness of her. It resonated with the hollow space inside Sarah. It wasn't pity. It was a strange kinship, a recognition of two solitary creatures occupying the same damp, forgotten corner of the world. On the fourth morning, a brittle, washed-out gray light finally broke through. The rain had dwindled to a mist. Sarah pulled on her worn boots and thick jacket, the damp cold seeping through instantly. The walk to the barn felt longer, the muddy path sucking at her feet. She pushed open the heavy door, the familiar scent of dust, old hay, and something faintly metallic, maybe rust, filling her nostrils. The silence inside was different than the house. Told her. Alive with the tiny sounds of settling wood, the scuttle of unseen insects, the soft cooing of pigeons nesting high in the rafters. She scanned the shadows, not expecting to see her, but hoping. Nothing. Just the familiar shapes of forgotten tools, stacked crates, the looming silhouette of the old tractor under its dusty tarp. She moved towards the sink, her boots echoing slightly. Then a sound. Not a growl. Not a hiss. A soft, almost imperceptible thump. From the hayloft above. Sarah looked up. High in the dimness, perched on the very edge of the loft opening. Shadow watched her. Not hidden. Not vanishing. Just sitting upright, her thick tortoiseshell fur fluffed slightly against the lingering chill. Those chartreuse eyes were fixed on Sarah, unblinking, but the intense hostility seemed muted, tempered. Maybe it was the light or the damp air, but Sarah sensed a shift, a fragile curiosity beneath the wariness. Sarah didn't speak. She moved slowly, deliberately, towards the spot near the door where she'd taken to leaving the nightly bowl of kibble. It was empty, licked clean as always. She picked up the plastic bowl, the sound of it scraping the concrete floor unnaturally loud. Shadow's ears twitched back, a subtle flicker of unease. Sarah rinsed the bowl under the trickle of cold water, filled it with a generous scoop of dry food from the sack she kept just inside the barn door, the rustle of the kibble loud in the stillness. She placed it back in its usual spot, then deliberately took several steps back, turning slightly away, pretending to examine a stack of weathered fence posts leaning against the wall. She could feel the cat's gaze on her back. Heavy. Calculating. The silence stretched, thick and tense. Sarah held her breath, focusing on the rough grain of the wood beneath her fingers, the smell of damp earth and decaying timber. Then, a soft rustle, like dry leaves stirred by a faint breeze. She didn't turn, didn't move a muscle. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shadow detach itself from the gloom near the ladder, a low, fluid shape, keeping close to the stacked hay bales, moving with infinite caution. Shadow approached the bowl, not in a straight line, but in a series of wary pauses, freezing, ears swiveling, eyes darting towards Sarah, then back to the food. She stopped, a good 3 feet from the bowl. Her body was low to the ground, tense as a coiled spring. She stared at the kibble, then at Sarah's back, then back at the kibble. A low, uncertain rumble vibrated in her throat, not a growl, more like a question. Sarah remained utterly still, her own heart pounding a steady rhythm against her ribs. Just take it. It's yours. Another pause, agonizingly long. Then, in one swift, silent motion, Shadow darted forward, snatched a single piece of kibble in her mouth, and retreated just as quickly to the safety of the hay bales. Sarah heard the faint crunch as she ate it. Then, silence again. Sarah risked a tiny glance. Shadow was back in her position, watching, waiting, assessing the risk. The single piece of kibble hadn't poisoned her. The human hadn't lunged. Slowly, painfully slowly, the ritual repeated. Dart, snatch, retreat, crunch. Dart, snatch, retreat, crunch. Each trip brought her infinitesimally closer to the bowl, her retreats slightly less frantic. Sarah stayed frozen, a statue pretending indifference, her muscles aching with the effort of stillness. The cold seeped deeper into her bones. The smell of the kibble, faintly fishy, mingled with the barn's damp earth scent. She listened to the rhythmic crunching, the soft pad of Shadow's feet on the concrete, the quiet rhythm of her own breathing. It was the most focused, the most present she'd felt in months. Not thinking about Philadelphia, not thinking about the engagement ring gathering dust in a drawer upstairs, not thinking about the terrifying blankness of her future. In this moment, with this wild creature cautiously accepting a gift. It took nearly 15 minutes. Shadow finally stood directly over the bowl, still tense, her body angled slightly away, ready to bolt. She lowered her head, not taking her eyes off Sarah, and began to eat properly, a rapid, efficient crunching. Her tail, thick and banded, remained low, twitching only slightly at the tip, a sign of residual nervousness, but also focus. Hunger overcoming fear. Just a little. Sarah didn't move until the last piece of kibble was gone. Shadow licked the bowl clean with a rough, pink tongue, then immediately retreated several paces, sitting down again, watching Sarah with that unwavering, pale-eyed stare. But the intensity was different. The raw hostility was gone, replaced by a deep, watchful assessment. Sarah slowly, very slowly, turned to face her fully. She didn't smile, didn't make any sudden gestures. She just met that strange, luminous gaze. "See," Sarah murmured, her voice barely a whisper in the vast barn. "Just food." Shadow blinked. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't affection. It wasn't trust. But it wasn't a threat either. It was acknowledgement. A tiny crack in the fortress wall. The next day, Sarah brought a small, slightly battered cushion she'd found in the attic, smelling faintly of mothballs. She placed it near the feed sacks, a good distance from the food bowl, a silent offering of warmth. She didn't see Shadow near it that day. But the following morning, the cushion bore the distinct impression of a small, curled body, the fabric slightly indented, warmed. The days settled into a fragile new rhythm. Sarah would come to the barn, tend to the water, maybe sweep a section of floor, always moving slowly, speaking softly if she spoke at all. Shadow would appear, sometimes from the hayloft, sometimes melting out of the shadows near the old tractor. She began to linger after eating, not approaching Sarah, but staying visible, perched on the feed sacks, or sitting neatly on an overturned bucket, observing. Her wariness remained, a constant hum beneath the surface, but the outright hostility faded. She started to vocalize tiny, quiet chirps, almost questioning, when Sarah first arrived. A sound Sarah hadn't heard before. One afternoon, colder than the rest, a bitter wind whistling through cracks in the barn walls. Sarah sat on an upturned crate near the door, nursing a mug of steaming tea, the warmth seeping into her chilled hands. She was simply watching the gray light filter through the high windows, lost in the familiar fog of her own displacement. Shadow was perched on her usual sacks, meticulously cleaning a front paw, her rough tongue rasping against the fur. Sarah sighed, a long, slow exhalation, the sound carrying her weariness, the loneliness that clung to her even here, even with this wary creature sharing the space. She stared into her tea, the steam curling upwards, a fragile ghost in the cold air. What am I even doing here? The thought echoed, hollow and familiar. A soft sound made her look up. Shadow had stopped grooming. She was looking directly at Sarah, her head tilted slightly, those pale eyes fixed on Sarah's face with an unnerving intensity. It wasn't the usual assessing stare. It felt different, sharper, more focused, as if she'd heard the sigh, felt the weight of it. Sarah held her gaze, surprised. The cat blinked, slowly, deliberately. Then the soft sound, not a chirp, but a low, almost questioning "Emmy?" It vibrated in the quiet, a sound that seemed to hang in the cold air, full of something Sarah couldn't name. Sarah didn't move, didn't speak. She just met those strange, luminous eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see just wariness, or hunger, or wildness. She saw tension, a flicker of something that felt like recognition, of the sigh, of the weariness, of the loneliness that mirrored her own. It was just a moment, a blink, a sound, but it landed deep inside Sarah. A small, warm stone dropped into the cold well of her isolation. Shadow lowered her head, resumed grooming, the connection broken as abruptly as it had formed. But the air in the barn felt subtly changed. Warmer, less empty. Sarah took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest this time. She looked at the cat, diligently cleaning her paw, utterly absorbed, seemingly unaware of the seismic shift her small, questioning sound had caused. Sarah didn't try to touch her, didn't try to bridge the physical distance. But she stayed, sitting on the crate, sipping her, sharing the quiet space with this feral creature who had just, in her own silent, feline way, acknowledged her pain. It was the first time since arriving at the farm that Sarah didn't feel entirely alone. The silence wasn't crushing anymore. It was shared, a fragile thread of understanding spun between a lost woman and a wild barn cat, a thread woven not with words, but with slow blinks, quiet chirps, and the profound, unexpected comfort of simply being seen. The cold barn, with its scent of dust and damp hay, felt for the first time like it held the faintest promise of shelter for both of them. The fragile peace of their shared silence, the tentative rhythm of cautious coexistence, lasted barely a week. Late November arrived, dragging with it a deeper, bone-aching cold that settled into the farmhouse timbers and turned the barn into a cavern of icy drafts. Sarah found herself layering sweaters, her breath perpetually visible in the dim interior. Shadow, too, seemed to feel it. Her thick tortoiseshell fur fluffed out even more, making her appear slightly rounder, puffier than before. At first, Sarah chalked it up to the season, a natural thickening against the cold. But then, subtle changes began to ripple through the barn cat's behavior, eroding the hard-won trust like frost-heaving stone. It started with the food. Shadow's appetite, always robust, became voracious, insatiable. The generous scoop of kibble Sarah left each evening vanished before dawn, and Shadow began appearing earlier, sometimes while Sarah was still in the barn filling water buckets. She'd hover closer than before, emitting a new sound, a low, persistent, almost mournful yowl. Not the warning rumble, not the questioning chirp, but a demanding, needy cry that scraped against Sarah's nerves. Her luminous eyes, fixed on Sarah or the food sack, held a desperate intensity that bordered on frantic. All right, Sarah murmured one bitingly cold morning, shivering as she poured an extra-large portion into the bowl. Shadow didn't wait for Sarah to step back. She dove in, eating with a frantic, gulping haste that was completely new, scattering kibble across the concrete. Sarah watched, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. Is she sick? The thought sent a jolt of cold fear through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. This cat, this fierce, independent ghost, was suddenly dependent, vulnerable, and Sarah, utterly unprepared, felt the weight of that responsibility settle heavily on her shoulders. Then came the scratching. It began at night. Sarah, lying awake in the creaking farmhouse, listening to the wind moan around the eaves, would hear it. A persistent, rhythmic scritch-scratch, echoing faintly from the barn. Not the casual claw sharpening she'd occasionally heard before, but something obsessive, relentless. Focused. The first time she investigated, flashlight beam cutting through the pre-dawn gloom, she found nothing. Shadow was a phantom in her own domain. But the next evening, as Sarah lingered near the old tractor after refilling the water, she saw it. Shadow, ignoring the fresh food for once, was hunched low against the far wall, the one partially obscured by stacked crates and the tractor itself. It was an interior wall, rough, ancient plaster over stone and timber. And Shadow was clawing at it, not randomly, but at a specific spot near the baseboard where the plaster was already cracked and crumbling. Her claws worked with furious, silent intensity, pulling away small chunks, her whole body vibrating with effort. Her tail lashed, not in anger, but with a strange, driven focus. "Hey," Sarah called softly, instinctively taking a step closer. "Shadow? What are you doing?" The cat froze. Instantly. Her head whipped around, those pale eyes wide, pupils dilated in the dim light. A low, guttural growl erupted from her throat, deeper, more threatening than any sound Sarah had heard from her before. It wasn't just a warning to stay back, it was a promise of violence. Sarah stopped dead. The raw ferocity in that sound, the sheer defensive panic, was terrifying. Shadow didn't flee. She stood her ground over the scratched spot, her body a taut, trembling arc. Fur fully bristled, staring Sarah down with unblinking menace. Sarah retreated slowly, hands raised slightly in a placating gesture she wasn't even conscious of making. Okay, it's your wall. Do what you need to do." Her heart hammered against her ribs. The fear was immediate, visceral. But beneath it, swirled a turbulent mix of confusion and hurt. The fragile connection, the slow blinks, the shared silence, felt shattered, replaced by this feral, protective rage. What is behind that wall? The question echoed, unanswered and unsettling. The scratching became a nightly ritual. Sarah learned to ignore it, or tried to. But the sound wormed its way into her consciousness, a constant, nagging counterpoint to her own anxieties. Shadow's daytime behavior became erratic. She'd wolf down her food, then vanish for hours. When she reappeared, she'd sometimes allow Sarah closer, even brushing against her boots briefly, her fluffed fur surprisingly soft, before seeming to remember herself and darting away. Other times, especially if Sarah lingered near the tractor wall, that low growl would rumble, a primal warning light in those pale eyes. The physical change became undeniable. Shadow wasn't just fluffed against the cold. Her sides, previously lean and wiry, were distinctly rounding. Firmly. Sarah's online searches late at night, huddled under blankets with her laptop, confirmed her dawning, terrifying suspicion. Pregnant. The voracious appetite, the frantic nesting behavior, the sudden mood swings, it all pointed to one thing. Shadow wasn't sick. She was carrying kittens. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow, stealing her breath. Kittens. In this drafty, dilapidated barn. In the dead of winter. With a mother who was half wild, and Sarah, who knew less than nothing about cats, let alone birthing them. Panic, cold and sick, washed over her. Visions of tiny, frozen bodies, of complications, of Shadow rejecting them, flooded her mind. The responsibility felt crushing, suffocating. How far along was she? Where would she have them? That frantic scratching. Was she trying to get into the wall? Was there a hollow space? An old nest? The mystery of the wall deepened, tangled now with the imminent, precarious reality of new life. One afternoon, gray and still, Sarah found Shadow lying on the battered cushion, not sleeping, but panting slightly, her sides visibly moving with rapid, shallow breaths. The rounded bulge of her belly was unmistakable. Fear clenched Sarah's heart. She moved slowly, cautiously towards her. "Hey girl," she whispered, her voice thick with worry. "You okay?" Shadow lifted her head, her eyes heavy-lidded, but alert. No growl this time, just a weary watchfulness. Sarah knelt slowly on the cold concrete, keeping a respectful distance. She could smell the cat scent, stronger now, musky, earthy. She could see the rapid rise and fall of her flank. The vulnerability was terrifying. Sarah's hand, almost of its own accord, began to inch forward, palm open, trembling slightly. Not to grab, just to offer. A gesture of connection, of reassurance she didn't even know how to give. Shadow watched the approaching hand. Her chartreuse eyes tracked its slow progress, unblinking. Her breathing hitched. Sarah held her breath, her own pulse roaring in her ears. Inches away. Shadow's nose twitched, sniffing the air near Sarah's fingers. For a heart-stopping second, Sarah thought she saw the faintest softening around the cat's eyes, a relaxation of the tense jaw. Shadow's head lowered, just a fraction, as if considering allowing. Then, a tremor ran through her body. Her eyes widened, snapping back to full alertness. A low, warning rumble vibrated in her chest, not as fierce as before, but clear. She tucked her head down, turning it slightly away, a definitive rejection. The moment of potential contact shattered. Sarah pulled her hand back as if burned. The hurt was sharp, surprising in its intensity. She hadn't realized how much she'd wanted that touch, that tangible confirmation of their fragile bond. But Shadow's message was clear. Her body, her kittens, her hidden place behind the wall, they were hers alone. Off limits. The gulf between them, momentarily bridged by shared loneliness, now yawned wider than ever, filled with the terrifying unknowns of impending birth and Shadow's fierce, protective instincts. The scratching at the wall wasn't just a mystery anymore. It felt like a desperate countdown. Sarah sat back on her heels, the cold concrete seeping through her jeans, the scent of dust and feline musk heavy in the air, utterly powerless, and utterly terrified for the wild creature whose world was about to change forever, and for the tiny lives hidden within her. The fragile peace was gone, replaced by a silent, chilling dread that settled over the barn like the deepening winter frost. Something immense, something life-changing, was clawing its way towards them, and Sarah had no idea how to meet it. The dread was a living thing, coiled cold and tight in Sarah's stomach, growing heavier with each passing day. Shadow's sides swelled, taut and round beneath her thick fur. Her frantic scratching at the wall intensified, becoming almost manic, a desperate, scraping rhythm that filled the pre-dawn hours, echoing through the silent farmhouse like a frantic heartbeat. Sarah lay awake. Listen, her own heart pounding in counterpoint, helplessness a bitter taste on her tongue. She'd prepared, as best she could. An old, deep cardboard box lined with soft, clean towels, tucked into the most sheltered corner of the barn, far from drafts, near the water spigot for easy access. She'd placed it there days ago, a silent, hopeful offering. Shadow had ignored it completely, sniffed it once with disdain, and returned to her relentless assault on the plaster near the tractor. What is she trying to reach? The question became an obsession, a knot Sarah couldn't untie, tangled with the terrifying reality of imminent birth. The air turned brittle, a sharp, crystalline cold that promised snow. Sarah felt it in her bones, a deep, persistent ache. Shadow felt it too. She became restless, pacing, unable to settle. The low, mournful yowls returned, longer, more plaintive, filled with a distress that scraped raw against Sarah's nerves. She stopped eating entirely, pacing, circling, returning again and again to the wall, scratching with a frantic, weakening energy. Her luminous eyes, when they met Sarah's, held a wild, trapped fear Sarah had never seen before. It was primal, terrifying. Then it happened. Late afternoon, the weak winter sun already sinking, casting long, distorted shadows across the barn floor. Sarah was forcing herself to sweep near the main doors, trying to focus on the mundane, the rhythmic swish-swish of the broom on concrete. A sound stopped her cold. Not a yowl, not a scratch. The sharp, guttural cry, like pain ripped from the throat. It came from behind the tractor. Sarah dropped the broom. It clattered loudly, the sound jarring in the sudden, charged silence. She moved, fast, but quietly, her boots barely making a sound on the gritty floor. Rounding the hulking shape of the tarp-covered tractor, she saw her. Shadow was on her side, pressed against the base of the wall she'd been clawing, her body rigid, trembling violently. Her legs were splayed, her belly contracting in visible, rippling waves. Her breath came in ragged, panting gasps, punctuated by another low, agonized moan. Her eyes, not hostility, not wariness, pure, unadulterated animal fear. And pain. Sarah froze, paralyzed. This was it. The moment she dreaded. The moment she was utterly unprepared for. The carefully prepared box, the clean towels, they were yards away, useless. Shadow was giving birth. Here, against this cold, rough wall she couldn't penetrate. She's trapped, Sarah realized with a jolt of horror. She chose this spot, but she can't get in. Another contraction seized Shadow. Her body arched, a strangled cry tearing from her, her claws scrabbling uselessly against the unyielding plaster, pulling away more chunks, revealing ancient, dark wood beneath. She was trying to burrow, to find the shelter her instincts screamed for, and failing, utterly failing. The vulnerability, the raw, desperate struggle was devastating. Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, hot and immediate, not just for Shadow, but for the sheer, terrifying helplessness of life arriving in such a brutal, exposed way. For the echo of her own powerlessness, facing the wreckage of her life months ago. She couldn't stand there. She couldn't watch this wild creature, who had slowly, tentatively allowed her presence, suffer alone in such primal terror. The fear for Shadow, for the kittens, overrode her own fear of being attacked. Sarah moved, not towards the wall, but towards the box. She grabbed it, the cardboard rough under her trembling hands, the towels inside soft and clean. She dragged it, scraping loudly, across the concrete floor, stopping a few feet away from the panting, trembling cat. Shadow's head jerked up, a weak, warning growl rumbling in her chest, her eyes wild with pain and fear. But she didn't lunge. She couldn't. Another contraction was building. Sarah knelt, slowly, keeping her distance but making herself visible. "It's okay, it's okay," she murmured, her voice thick with tears she couldn't hold back, trembling almost as much as the cat. "I brought I brought somewhere soft, warm. She gestured weakly towards the box, her hand shaking. Shadow stared at her, panting, her sides heaving. The growl died in her throat, replaced by a desperate, high-pitched whimper. She looked at Sarah, then at the box, then back at the wall, her instincts warring, torn between the place she'd chosen but couldn't access, and the terrifying proximity of the human offering something unknown. Another contraction hit, harder, longer. Shadow cried out, a sound that ripped through Sarah, her body convulsing against the cold floor, her claws digging into the exposed wood. Sarah couldn't bear it. Without thinking, propelled by a surge of protective anguish, she reached out, not to touch Shadow, but to the largest chunk of plaster she'd clawed away. She grabbed it, pulling, crumbling more of the fragile material, revealing a dark, narrow gap between the ancient wooden studs, a hollow space barely wider than her hand. It wasn't a nest. It was just darkness. Cold, empty, inaccessible darkness. "See," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking, tears streaming freely down her cold cheeks. She held up the crumbling plaster, a futile gesture. "There's nothing, just space. Cold space. The box, it's warm." She pointed again, her finger trembling. "For them, for your babies." Shadow's gaze locked onto Sarah's face, onto her tears. The wild panic in her eyes flickered, replaced by a dazed, exhausted confusion. The pain was overwhelming her. The contractions were coming faster, harder. She whimpered again, a sound of utter defeat, of primal need overriding millennia of feral caution. Her body shuddered, straining. With a final, agonized push, slick with fluid, a tiny, dark shape slid onto the cold concrete floor between her legs. Sarah gasped, a soft intake of breath. A kitten. Tiny, impossibly fragile, still encased in its glistening sack. Shadow, exhausted, trembling, instinctively turned, her rough tongue rasping against the sack, tearing it open, cleaning the tiny, squirming creature with frantic, maternal licks. The kitten, wet and dark, emitted a faint, reedy cry. But the terror wasn't over. Shadow was panting hard, another contraction already building. She needed shelter. She nudged the tiny kitten weakly, trying to gather it closer, but the cold floor, the exposure, it was all wrong. Her instincts screamed for enclosure, for darkness. Her wild eyes darted from her kitten to the impossible gap in the wall, to Sarah, to the box. Sarah held her breath. This was it. The breaking point. She remained perfectly still, tears drying cold on her face, her hands open, empty, offering only the box and her presence. A silent plea. Shadow looked at her, a long, piercing look. Those pale chartreuse eyes, filled with exhaustion, and a dawning, desperate trust. Then, with a strength born of pure maternal need, she gathered the tiny, damp kitten gently in her mouth, its faint cries muffled. She pushed herself up, trembling, her belly huge and taut. And, slowly, agonizing, she crawled, dragging her heavy body, the few feet towards the cardboard box. Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe. She watched, her heart hammering against her ribs, as Shadow, with immense effort, hauled herself over the low edge of the box, collapsing inside onto the soft towels. She immediately curled around her kitten, licking it fiercely, warming it, a low, rumbling purr starting deep in her chest, a sound of pure, exhausted relief. Shelter, warmth, safety, found, not in the wall, but in the offering of the human she'd once regarded as a threat. Sarah let out a shuddering breath, a sob catching in her throat. Relief, overwhelming, washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. Shadow was safe. The kitten was safe. For now. But Shadow wasn't done. Another contraction seized her, stronger than before. She stiffened, a low groan escaping, her purr cutting off abruptly. She pushed, straining, her focus entirely inward now, on the life forcing its way into the world. Sarah remained frozen, a silent witness, her own tears flowing again, but now mixed with awe. The raw, messy, terrifying miracle of it. Another kitten emerged, slick and struggling. Shadow turned, cleaning it with the same fierce tenderness, her purr starting again, louder this time, a primal vibration of love and effort. Sarah watched, mesmerized, her earlier helplessness replaced by a profound, humbling stillness. She was seeing the most vulnerable, the most powerful moment of Shadow's life. The fierce barn cat, the untouchable phantom, was a mother. Fierce still, but with a ferocity transformed, directed entirely towards these tiny, squirming lives. The Shadow nudged the second kitten, positioning it near her warmth, and looked up, directly at Sarah. Not with fear, not with wariness. With a look of such profound, exhausted trust, it stole Sarah's breath. A look that said, "I am here. They are here. With you." Sarah didn't dare move closer, but she smiled, a wobbly, tear-streaked smile, and whispered, "You're doing so good, Mama. So good." Her voice was thick with emotion, a love she hadn't known she was capable of feeling blossoming fiercely in her chest, warm and real and utterly unexpected. Shadow held her gaze for a long moment, that deep, rumbling purr vibrating through the cardboard box, a sound of pure, primal contentment mixed with utter exhaustion. Then, her head lowered, resting gently on the towel beside her kittens, her eyes drifting closed, not in sleep, but in a deep, focused vigilance. Her body curled protectively around the two tiny, dark shapes, licking them intermittently, the rhythmic rasp of her tongue the only sound besides her purr. Sarah stayed, kneeling on the cold concrete. The scent of birth, metallic and earthy, filled the air. The barn felt charged, sacred. The scratching wall, the mystery, the fear, it all fell away. What remained was this, a fierce, wild heart, choosing trust in its moment of greatest vulnerability. Choosing her. The connection wasn't tentative anymore. It was forged in the fire of pain and fear, tempered by an act of desperate acceptance. Sarah looked at Shadow, curled protectively around her newborns in the box she had provided, and saw not just a cat, but a reflection of her own capacity to trust, to nurture, to begin again. The cold dread dissolved, replaced by a warmth that started deep in her core, spreading outwards, filling the vast, echoing space of the barn and the echoing space within herself. The breaking point wasn't an end. It was a beginning, raw, messy, terrifying, and utterly breathtakingly beautiful. The world shrank, condensed, to the dimensions of a battered cardboard box lined with faded towels. Outside its low walls, the barn remained vast, echoing, filled with the creeping chill of deep winter. Icicles, like frozen tears, formed jagged teeth along the roof's edge outside the high windows. The wind found every crack and crevice, whistling a mournful tune through the rafters. But inside the box, a tiny, fierce sun burned. Sarah moved through the barn now with the hushed reverence of someone entering a sacred space. The frantic scraping at the wall had ceased, replaced by a new soundtrack, the soft, rhythmic rasp of a mother's tongue, the faint, reedy peeps of newborns, and the deep, resonant purr that seemed to emanate from Shadow's very core, a primal lullaby vibrating through the cardboard. That purr, constant, profound, became the heartbeat of Sarah's days. It was a sound she hadn't known she needed, a vibration that seemed to settle her own restless spirit. She approached the box cautiously, always announcing her presence with a soft murmur. "Just me, Mama, just bringing breakfast." She'd placed the bowl of high-calorie kitten food, recommended after frantic late-night internet searches, a respectful distance away. Shadow's chartreuse eyes would lift, watchful, but the old, feral hostility was gone. Transformed. Her gaze held a new intensity, a fierce, protective focus, but beneath it, an undeniable layer of weary trust. She'd wait until Sarah retreated several steps, then emerge, stretching stiffly, her belly still loose but noticeably deflated, moving with a new, deliberate slowness that spoke of deep exhaustion and deep purpose. She'd eat ravenously, barely pausing to breathe, her ears constantly swiveling back towards the box, listening for the slightest sound from her babies. Then, swiftly, she'd return, curling back around the tiny forms, the purr restarting instantly, a warm engine revving back to life. Sarah never peered in uninvited. She respected the boundary Shadow had drawn. But sometimes, kneeling nearby, pretending to organize rusty tools or sweep non-existent dust, she'd catch glimpses. Shadow's body was a living fortress. Two tiny creatures, impossibly small, dark little shapes barely distinguishable from the shadows of the towels, nestled against the warmth of her belly. She licked them incessantly, cleaning, stimulating, her movements precise, utterly absorbed. The devotion was absolute, a physical force radiating from her. Sarah watched, a lump forming in her throat. This was the fierceness Shadow had always possessed, channeled now into pure, unadulterated nurture. The barn cat who'd once threatened with tooth and claw now wielded only the weapon of relentless, tender care. The days blurred into a quiet, demanding rhythm dictated by the tiny lives in the box. Sarah's own life, the vast emptiness of the farmhouse, the gnawing questions about her future, receded. Her focus narrowed to the essentials, keeping the barn as draft-free as possible, ensuring fresh water was always near, providing mountains of food for the ravenous queen. She brought a space heater, positioning it cautiously several feet away, its gentle hum adding to the box's warm symphony. She researched frantically, learning about kitten development, the critical first weeks, the dangers of fading kitten syndrome, the importance of maternal warmth. The fear didn't vanish, it just changed shape, becoming a constant, low-level hum beneath the surface of her vigilance. One bitterly cold morning, a week after the birth, Sarah approached as usual, bowl in hand. Shadow was nursing, a sight that still filled Sarah with awe. The tiny kittens, their eyes still tightly shut, kneaded rhythmically against her belly, tiny paws paddling the air, emitting soft, contented squeaks. Shadow's purr was a deep, rolling thunder. Sarah placed the food down, started to retreat. Shadow lifted her head. Not warily, but deliberately. She looked at Sarah, and slowly, deliberately shifted her body. Just slightly. An adjustment. But it exposed the two nursing kittens more fully to Sarah's view. It wasn't an accident. It felt like an offering. A sharing. Sarah froze. Her breath caught. She could see them clearly now. Two little bodies, still mostly dark, but details emerging. Tiny, perfect ears flattened against velvety skulls. Minuscule claws, like pinpricks of pearl, flexing against Shadow's fur. the rhythmic pulse of their suckling. They were real, tangible, alive, thriving, because of Shadow, because of the box, because of the fragile thread of trust that had held in that moment of primal terror. "Look at them," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't name. Joy, wonder, a profound, humbling gratitude. "Look at your beautiful babies, Mama." Shadow held Sarah's gaze. Her purr deepened, vibrated through the air between them. She didn't blink. It was a look of shared understanding, of mutual awe at the tiny miracles curled against her warmth. Then, incredibly, Shadow lowered her head, nudged one of the kittens gently, and began cleaning its tiny back, utterly focused again. But the moment hung suspended, a bridge built not just of necessity, but of something softer, something like kinship. Later that day, emboldened, Sarah brought a fresh, thick towel, warmed slightly by the heater. "Thought you might like a clean one, Mama," she murmured, approaching slowly, holding the towel out like a peace offering. Shadow watched her, alert but calm. Sarah stopped near the box, didn't reach in. She gently placed the warm towel on the edge, within Shadow's reach, then retreated several paces. Shadow looked at the towel, sniffed the air. Then, with careful deliberation, she hooked a paw over the edge of the box, pulling the towel towards her. She nosed it, arranged it, then, with surprising dexterity for a creature exhausted and focused on newborns, she managed to tuck part of it underneath her kittens, adding a fresh layer of warmth beneath them. She settled back down, the new towel now part of their nest, and resumed her purring vigil. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the space heater. It was trust, reciprocated in a small, practical way. Shadow had accepted her gift, used it for her babies. Life. Sarah realized one evening as she sat on her upturned crate, watching the soft rise and fall of Shadow's flank as she slept, her kitten's tiny bumps against her side, was no longer about the grand escape she'd planned, or the terrifying blankness of the future. It was about this small, vital circle of warmth in a cold barn. It was about showing up with food, with water, with a warm towel. It was about bearing witness to the quiet miracle of survival, of fierce love blossoming in the unlikeliest place. Her own loneliness, that vast, echoing hollowness, hadn't vanished. But it had been joined by something else. A purpose. Small, specific, demanding, but real. She was needed. Not for a marketing campaign, not for a relationship that had crumbled, but by this feral cat and her vulnerable newborns. The simplicity of it, the sheer, grounding weight of their dependence, was a balm she hadn't known she craved. She thought of the scratched wall, the frantic desperation, the cold, empty space behind it. Shadow had clawed at the past, at a memory of shelter perhaps, or just a blind instinct. But life, new life, had demanded something different. Something present. Something offered. And Shadow, in her moment of greatest vulnerability, had chosen to accept it. Chosen the box. Chosen the proximity of the human she'd once feared. Sarah looked at her own hands, chapped from the cold, calloused from farm work. Hands that had returned an engagement ring, signed a resignation letter, packed boxes in a daze. Hands that now carefully scooped kibble, filled water bowls, placed warm towels near a cardboard nursery. They felt different now. Not just rougher, but useful. Grounded in a reality far removed from the polished surfaces of her old life. The frantic scratching had stopped, replaced by the soft sounds of new life. The mystery of the wall remained, but it no longer held tension. It was just part of the barn's story, a testament to Shadow's past struggle, overshadowed now by the vibrant, purring present in the center of the floor. As the weak afternoon light faded, casting long, blue shadows across the barn, Sarah rose quietly. Shadow opened one eye, a pale gleam in the dimness, her purr never faltering. Sarah smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Sleep well, Mama," she whispered. "I'll be back." She walked out into the biting cold, the wind whipping at her jacket. The field stretched away, monochrome and frozen. The farmhouse loomed, still too big, too quiet. But the hollow feeling inside her, it wasn't gone, but it was filled now. Not erased, but layered over with something warm, something purring, something profoundly real. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was keeping watch over a fierce heart that had softened, and the tiny sparks of life it fiercely protected. The cold silence of the farm wasn't an emptiness to fear. It was the space holding their fragile, thriving warmth. The rhythm of her days had changed, irrevocably, centered around a battered box and the quiet thunder of a mother's love. The deep winter freeze held the Pennsylvania countryside in its iron grip. Snow drifted high against the barn walls, muffling the world outside into a silent, white hush. Inside, the space heater hummed its steady, warm counterpoint to the wind's occasional moan around the eaves. The battered cardboard box remained the pulsing heart of the barn, radiating a warmth that felt almost defiant against the pervasive cold. Shadow's purr was its constant bass note, a deep, contented rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air. The kittens had become kittens. No longer just dark, squirming shapes, but tiny creatures unfolding daily. Their sealed eyes had opened, first as dark slits, then revealing wide, bewildered blue orbs that stared unseeingly into the strange new world. Their ears, once flattened, now stood up like miniature velvety radar dishes, twitching at every sound. Sarah's approaching footsteps, the clink of the food bowl, the distant coo of the pigeons. They wobbled on unsteady legs within the confines of their towel-lined universe, bumping into each other and their mother's immense, warm flank emitting tiny, indignant squeaks. Their world was scent and warmth and the constant, reassuring vibration of Shadow's purr. Sarah's routine was sacred. Food, water, a fresh warm towel offered daily. She'd sit on her crate, a respectful distance away, simply watching the miracle unfold. Shadow remained vigilant, her chartreuse eyes missing nothing, but the ferocity was now entirely protective, not defensive. She tolerated Sarah's presence not as a necessary evil, but as part of the landscape, a trusted provider. One afternoon, as Sarah watched a kitten attempt a comically ambitious climb over its sibling, only to tumble into the soft folds of the towel, she noticed something new. The weak winter sunlight, filtering through a high window, caught the downy fur of the tumbling kitten. It wasn't just dark anymore. It shimmered, a dense, impossibly soft-looking pelt, catching the light with a subtle, silvery sheen. It looked different, softer than Shadow's thick, coarse tortoiseshell fur, almost plush. "Look at you," Sarah murmured, leaning forward slightly without thinking. "What's this?" Shadow, alert as ever, lifted her head. But instead of a warning look, she watched Sarah, then deliberately nudged the tumbled kitten gently with her nose, encouraging it back towards her belly. As the kitten wobbled closer, the light caught its fur again. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen on a cat. Denser, finer, with an ethereal, luminous quality. It reminded her of chinchilla fur. The thought was absurd, yet there it was. The next day, in better light, Sarah saw it clearly on both kittens. Their base color was a deep, smoky charcoal, but overlaying it was this extraordinary undercoat of the finest, palest silver hairs, giving the overall effect of a living, breathing piece of moonlit velvet. It wasn't just soft-looking. When Shadow groomed them, her tongue seemed to sink into depths of plushness. Chinchilla fur. The description stuck in Sarah's mind, a whisper of impossible softness emerging from the toughest barn cat imaginable. It was Shadow's final, breathtaking surprise. Her fierce exterior, hiding this astonishing, luxurious softness in her offspring. A physical manifestation of the tenderness she'd unlocked within herself. One bitingly cold morning, Sarah approached with the warm towel. The kittens were nursing, tiny paws rhythmically kneading, emitting soft, contented murmurs. Shadow lay on her side, purring, one paw draped possessively over her brood. Sarah placed the towel gently on the edge of the box. "Fresh one for you, Mama," she whispered. Shadow opened her eyes. She looked at the towel. Slowly, deliberate, she stretched. Not away, but towards Sarah. She extended one front leg, then the other, her body elongating, the movement languid, trusting. Her claws flexed gently, retracting. She yawned widely, revealing sharp little teeth, then settled back down, her gaze resting calmly on Sarah. The stretch wasn't just physical. It was an invitation, a lowering of the final barrier. Sarah's breath hitched. She knew what this meant, the ultimate feline gesture of trust. She remained perfectly still for a long moment, her heart pounding. Slowly, so slowly, she lowered her hand, palm open and relaxed, towards the edge of the box, near Shadow's outstretched paw. Not reaching for the kittens. Not even reaching for Shadow. Just offering her presence. Closer than ever before. Shadow watched the hand descend. Her pupils dilated slightly, but there was no tension in her body. No low growl. Just calm observation. Sarah's fingertips hovered inches from the thick fur of Shadow's shoulder. She could feel the heat radiating from the cat's body, smell the warm, milky scent of her and the kittens. The purr seemed to deepen, vibrating the air Sarah's fingers almost touched. Shadow moved. Not away. Not defensively. She tilted her head, ever so slightly, and nudged her cheek against Sarah's hovering fingertips. The contact was electric. Soft, warm, and utterly transformative. Sarah felt the dense, coarse texture of Shadow's tortoiseshell fur against her skin. She felt the powerful vibration of the purr travel up her arm, resonating deep in her own chest. She felt the absolute, unguarded trust in that simple nudge. This wild creature, who had once threatened her with feral rage, was asking for affection. Tears welled, hot and sudden, blurring her vision. She didn't pull away. She didn't push. She simply let her fingertips rest against Shadow's cheek, feeling the rumble, the warmth, the living reality of this hard-won connection. Shadow leaned into the touch, just slightly, her eyes drifting half-closed, the purr becoming a deep, contented thunder. It lasted only seconds. Then, Shadow turned her head, gently disengaging, and resumed licking a kitten's head, her focus returning to her brood. But the moment, the profound, silent exchange, lingered in the air, thick and sweet as honey. Sarah slowly withdrew her hand, cradling it with the other, as if holding something precious. The sensation of Shadow's fur, the vibration of her trust, was imprinted on her skin. She looked down at her own hands, the hands that had built spreadsheets and packed away a broken engagement, now calloused from farm work, smelling faintly of kibble and hay. hands that had just been deemed safe enough for a touch by the fiercest heart she knew. It wasn't just about touching the cat. It was about being touched back, recognized, accepted, not as a provider, but as someone worthy of that simple, profound gesture. Later, sitting at the old, scarred kitchen table in the farmhouse, a mug of tea warming her palms, Sarah opened the dusty journal she'd found in Aunt Martha's things months ago and never written in. The blank pages had felt like an accusation. Now, under the warm glow of the overhead lamp, the words flowed, quiet and sure, describing not just the chinchilla soft fur of the kittens, but the rough, purring nudge against her fingers. She wrote about the transformation, shadows, and her own. She wrote about the fierce tenderness that could bloom in the coldest places. She wrote about trust offered and trust received. She chose the box, Sarah wrote, the pen scratching softly on the paper. She chose the warmth offered. And today, she chose my hand. Not because she needed food or water, just because the simplicity of it took her breath away. The fiercest thing I've ever known asked for a gentle touch. From me. She looked out the window at the snow-blanketed fields, glittering under a sliver of moon. The vastness didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like the necessary space around something precious. The barn wasn't just a refuge. It was the cradle of a small, purring revolution. Shadow's gift wasn't just the kittens, or even the astonishing softness of their fur. It was the revelation Sarah found scribbled in the journal, the truth settling warm and heavy in her chest. Strength isn't just about surviving alone. Sometimes, the fiercest act is allowing yourself to be soft, to accept the warmth offered, to lean into the touch. The barn cat had clawed her way through terror to find it. And watching her, Sarah realized she had too. The revelation wasn't just about Shadow and her kittens. It was the final, shimmering gift Shadow left at Sarah's fingertips, a reflection of her own unexpected, hard-won softness, emerging from the winter of her solitude. The first crocuses pushed through the frozen earth in early March, their purple petals trembling against the lingering chill. Winter loosened its grip slowly, reluctantly, but the promise of spring hummed in the air, a quiet, persistent vibration not unlike Shadow's purr. The barn, once a cavern of shadows and drafts, now held pockets of warmth where sunlight pooled through the high windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like tiny, suspended stars. Sarah knelt beside the cardboard box, now reinforced with a second layer and lined with a thick fleece blanket, and watched as the kittens tumbled over each other in a whirl of silver-tipped fur and tiny, needle-sharp claws. They were no longer helpless, squirming things but miniature forces of nature, all boundless energy and curiosity. Their once blue eyes had darkened into a striking, luminous green, mirroring shadows, though their fur remained impossibly plush, a living paradox of wild elegance. Shadow herself lay nearby, stretched out in a rare moment of repose, her body relaxed but her eyes ever watchful. She no longer flinched at Sarah's approach. Instead, she greeted her with slow blinks, the tip of her tail flicking in lazy acknowledgement. Sometimes, she even stood and arched her back in a long, luxurious stretch before padding over to brush against Sarah's legs, not for food, not for anything but the simple, startling pleasure of contact. It was one of those mornings, soft with early spring light, when Sarah reached into the box and, for the first time, scooped one of the kittens into her hands. Shadow watched, her gaze steady, but she didn't tense, didn't growl. She simply observed as Sarah cradled the tiny creature against her chest, feeling the rapid, hummingbird beat of its heart against her palm. The kitten, the bolder of the two, A little female with a dusting of silver like frost on her paws peered up at Sarah with wide, unblinking eyes. Then, with a tiny, rumbling purr of her own, she curled into the warmth of Sarah's hold, her chinchilla-soft fur impossibly light against her skin. Sarah exhaled, a slow, shuddering breath. The weight of the moment settled over her, not just the kitten in her hands, but the journey that had led here. The scratched wall, the blood and terror of birth, the fragile, hard-won trust that had grown between her and Shadow, brick by brick, purr by purr. She looked at Shadow, who met her gaze evenly, those pale green eyes holding something deeper than understanding. Something like kinship. We did this, Sarah thought, her throat tightening. Together. And then, as if hearing the unspoken words, Shadow stood, stretched, and patted over. She didn't jump onto Sarah's lap. She wasn't that kind of cat, and never would be. But she sat beside her, close enough that her fur brushed Sarah's knee, and began to purr. A deep, resonant sound that filled the barn, the space between them, the hollow places inside Sarah that had once ached with loneliness. The kitten in Sarah's hand squirmed, then wriggled free, leaping back into the box with an indignant squeak. Shadow gave her a quick, maternal lick before turning her attention back to Sarah. For a long moment, they simply sat there, human and cat, in a silence that no longer felt empty. The meaning in the mess. This was never just a story about a barn cat, or even about kittens. It was about the quiet, seismic shifts that happen when we least expect them, when we're not even looking for them. Sarah had come to this farm to disappear, to hide from the wreckage of her old life, the failures she couldn't face, the future she couldn't imagine. Shadow had been a ghost in the rafters, a creature of tooth and claw, trusting no one, needing nothing. And yet, here they were. A woman who had forgotten how to hope. A cat who had never known safety. And between them, a bridge built not from grand gestures, but from small, daily acts of care. A bowl of food left out. A warm towel offered. A hand extended and, against all odds, a cheek pressed gently against it. This was the lesson Shadow had taught her, without ever meaning to. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not to survive alone, but to let yourself be softened. To accept the warmth when it's offered. To lean into the touch. The last gift. The kittens grew. The days lengthened. Sarah didn't keep them. She knew better than to think Shadow would tolerate that. But she found them good homes, with people who marveled at their impossible fur, their wild, soft spirits. Shadow stayed. Not as a pet. Not as anything so simple as that. But as a presence. A companion. A living reminder that even the fiercest hearts can learn to trust. And sometimes, on the coldest nights, when the wind howled through the old farmhouse eaves, Sarah would wake to find a warm weight at the foot of her bed. Shadow, curled just close enough to share her heat, her purr a quiet thunder in the dark. She never stayed till morning. Never crossed that final line into domestication. But she came. And that was the final gift. Not belonging. Not ownership. But choice. The choice to return. The end and the beginning. If this story touched you, if you've ever known loneliness or love or the quiet miracle of an unexpected connection, then do me a favor. Like this video. Subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human, even when they're about cats. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? And most importantly, ring that bell icon so you never miss a new tale. Because stories like this, they're not just entertainment. They're lifelines, reminders, tiny, purring beacons of hope in a world that sometimes feels too cold. So hit that button. Leave a comment. Let me know this story mattered to you. Because Shadow's story might be ending here, but yours? Yours is just beginning. See you in the next one.